How many world wars has there been? Two, right? Seems like an easy answer. What if I told you there's been more than two world wars? So, what world war are we on? Stay tuned to hear my answer. Hey, welcome back to The Desperate Historian. I'm your host, Dr. Aaron Miller, here to talk about history and have a little bit of fun along the way. I guess to determine how many world wars there's been, actually, it depends upon how you define a world war. And I would say it has to involve a large part of the world, of course, and impact a large part of the world's population and geographic area. So it has to meet some conditions, I think. It has to be a continuous or nearly continuous conflict without a long interruption taking place between two or more major powers or empires. It has to have key or sustained or significant battles in theaters in at least three continents of the world's six inhabited continents. So you'd have to be on at least half of the world's inhabited continents, involving a large portion of the world's geography and or population. So it has to be globe spanning. That's what I would argue. It also, I think, has to be a nearly total war, a war that a nation or empire is using most of its economy, most of its resources, most of the populations are engaged in, or focused on fighting or producing goods at winning this war. Interestingly, the first use of the term World War came in an 1848 Scottish newspaper, and the German writer August Wilhelm Otto Niemann also used it in the title of his 1904 novel, Der Weltkrieg, Deutsche Trauma, The World War, German Trauma. And what we refer to as World War I was first called the Great War or the World War until 1939. But it was on the eve of the Second World War when the terms the First World War and the Second World War came into use. The term First World War was first used by German biologist Ernst Haeckel in September 1914 when referring to the Great War. And the first designation of World War II first appeared in Time magazine in 1939 near the outbreak of the Second World War. So let's try to figure out what world war we're on now. Let's look at some of the world's major conflicts and see if they fit into our definition of a world war. Well, there was Alexander's Wars of Conquest, which spanned the globe from 336 to 323 BC. And yes, these are on three continents. They're on Europe and they're in Asia and North Africa. But this is mainly the Mediterranean world. It's not involved in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not in the Western and Southern hemispheres. So I would not call this a world war. Well, what about the Roman Wars, the Roman Wars of Conquest? These were mainly subduing peoples that the Romans called the barbarians, and not really a singular conflict. This is rather a series of conflicts, and Rome did see a long time of peace during its existence. So I wouldn't call these world wars. If you think about some of these examples of these wars, it'd be like the Punic Wars with Carthage, or the Gallic Wars between Rome and the Gauls. These mainly involve the Mediterranean world, Europe, North Africa. So throughout Rome's history, yes, they did involve fighting on three continents, but the fighting was mainly localized around the Mediterranean world, and then again in the northern and eastern hemispheres, and not on a sustained conflict on three continents. What about the Mongol Wars of Conquest and Invasions from 1206 to 1368 AD? The Mongols are fascinating to study. They created the world's largest contiguous land empire. But again, these were mainly battles that took place in Europe and Asia, limited to the northern and eastern hemispheres. What about the Crusades? Were the Crusades a world war? The Crusades were a series of religious conflicts. These were attempts by European leaders of nation states, to try to retake the Holy Land. These are on three continents. They're in Europe, Africa, and Asia, but they're not globe-spanning wars, and they're mainly confined to Europe and the Middle East. However, if you think of the conquistadors, considering that they consider themselves crusaders, then you could argue that these conquistadors brought these religious wars to the Americas, expanding this into a more global conflict. This is a hard call here, and I'm probably going to get some people to disagree with me on this one, but I'm going to say this is not a world war due to the Crusades' limited scope, the different actors, and their main focus being in Europe and the Middle East, and being sort of limited to that area, that geographic area. So I'm going to say that the Crusades are not a world war, but hey, feel free to disagree with me. Um, and then if there are lots throughout history, there are lots of long, intense conflicts in Europe, but these mainly involved European powers. We could look at the Hundred Years' War between England and France between 1337 and 1453, the Ottoman Portuguese conflicts and confrontations from 1538 to 1559. But these were mainly involved with the Ottoman Empire in North Africa and fought in the Indian Ocean. There's also the Ottoman Venetian conflicts, the Venetian city state conflicts between 1396 and lasted into the 1700s. But again, relatively confined fighting, not globe spanning. You had the 80 Years' War between 1568 and 1648, the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. The 30 Years' War was mainly, this is a big conflict, but it was mainly limited to Central and Eastern Europe. Um, but what about the 7 Years' War? And I think here's where we get to our first truly world war. 7 Years' War was from 1756 to 1763. In North America, it's referred to as the French and Indian War, and I think this is a truly global conflict. You had vast empires, big coalitions fighting one another. You had Great Britain, Prussia, Portugal, and Russia on one side fighting France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. And many of these powers had colonies throughout the world in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. There were major decisive battles in Europe, the Americas, Asia, India. There were more minor confrontations in Africa and naval engagements around the world. So I would call this the world's first world war. Winston Churchill called it the First World War. So who am I to disagree with Winston Churchill? Well, what about the Napoleonic Wars that came later? This is from 1803 to 1815. Are these world wars? I'd say yes, they fit our definition of a world war. Although they're mainly focused in Europe, they led to colonial conflicts and wars of independence throughout the Americas. There were also battle and campaigns on 4 continents and 5 oceans, so it is globe spanning. There are also other conflicts that are connected to it or resulted from it, including the War of 1812 and the Haitian Revolution. So I would call the Napoleonic Wars another world war. So that would be World War II. So then that gets us to our traditional world wars. So that would World War One from 1914 to 1918 become World War Three, and then World War Two becomes World War Four. So what about conflicts since World War Two? What about the Cold War? Well, the major combatants were, Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, versus the United States and NATO, and China and its allies versus the West, NATO, and the United States. But the major powers were rarely in direct confrontation with one another. Yes, there are hot wars in Korea and Vietnam. These are part of it, as well as many proxy wars, such as the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. But rarely were these powers in direct confrontation with one another and solely focused on that war with major segments of the population fighting in the war or working to produce goods for those wars. So I would say the Cold War is not a world war. Well, what about the global war on terror? Does that meet our definition? This is the war the United States launched on terror after 9/11. The United States fought wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and confrontations in many other nations around the world, spanning the globe. But this is not really between major powers. This is more between the United States and terrorist organizations, the United States and its allies and terrorist organizations, as well as some minor countries too that supported these terrorist organizations. So I would not define the global war on terror as another world war. So that would put us at 4 world wars: the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic conflicts, the Napoleonic Wars, World War One, and World War Two. Now, I'm not for renaming the wars or anything like that. That would cause way too much confusion. And my definition is not the only definitions that are out there. Perhaps there's one I left out. Perhaps you have a different definition for a world war. Hey, leave those comments leave those as feedback in the comments. If you like this kind of content, do me a favor, hit those like and subscribe buttons and share this content with your friends. Hey, thanks for stopping by to talk about history for a little bit, have a little bit of fun. I'll see you next time on The Desperate Historian.